So, as you know, and I often talk about on this channel, Welsh Rugby is in a pretty dire situation at the moment, and it's in a really precarious position on and off the pitch. It's quite worrying as a fan, and unfortunately, since I've started this channel nearly 2.5 years ago now, it's been pretty dire. So maybe I'm thinking I'm bad luck, but this is a video I've wanted to make for a while because I've constantly racked my brain as where was the moment where it really started going wrong and how did we end up where we were. And I think hopefully I can get it across in this video, but it's been a death by 1,000 cuts, and there's been decisions and incidents that have happened along the way that have ended us to where this been. It's kind of been like an avalanche that has slowly picked up momentum. So I've picked out a few. These are the big ones. So the first one was the missed opportunity of joining the English League. Now, this is something we've talked about a lot on this channel. It gets something that gets talked about a lot. But there was a chance just after professionalism had taken over, and Welsh Rugby was kind of in a position where there was just money going out, and the clubs were not in a financial position to be able to survive. The WRU were bailing them out constantly, so they came up with this 10-year loyalty agreement. Now, I've done a deep dive into this in a different video. I'll put the link in the description, and you can go and have a look at that later if you want to have the proper in-depth of all of the surrounding stuff that was going on at this moment. But just the long and short of it, they decided the WRU needed to control all of Welsh Rugby and a club game. It was 8 clubs, and most of them were happy to sign, but Cardiff and Swansea were not happy because they didn't think the union knew what was going on and what they were going to be doing, so they refused to sign up to a 10-year agreement, not knowing what league they were going to play and how funds were going to be allocated, etc. So they decided they're not going to sign up, and therefore they couldn't play in WRU sanctioned games. They ended up having the Rebel season where they played English teams and basically were part of the English setup. The WRU, of course, didn't like this, so they tried to bring them back by starving them of any money and any funding. This all came to a kind of a head where Swansea and Cardiff, with an English delegation, met with the Welsh Rugby Union, and they came into a room and said, right, let's work this out. Let's just form a league together, rather than, a couple of your teams playing here and the rest of you all doing your own thing over there. The way it worked out is the English delegation were offering a position for 5 clubs. The WRU then came back with them and said, we're not going to join unless we can have 10 clubs in your league. Bearing in mind the 10-year loyalty agreement that they were trying to get all the main clubs to sign up for was for 8 teams. Obviously, England didn't agree to that, and the union just stormed off and walked out of the meeting, and that was the last chance we had to join the English League. Now, the annoying part of that is 2 or 3 years later, they formed the 5 regions, so that would have worked out perfect, but it's by the by. But this isn't, don't get me wrong, this is not the silver bullet that would have fixed everything, but I think having more interest in club rugby, because there would be more of the historical rivalries, the cross-border competition where you could just drive to your destination rather than be forced to take a flight. I think that would have improved things, would have improved money, and who knows, could have just kept more interest in rugby in general, in Welsh Rugby. But that wasn't to be. The next part then was the actual forming of the regions and what the regions have kind of ended up being. So the regions were of course brought together because they wanted fewer teams to consolidate the funds and the talent into a smaller place, so the standards were higher in those training sessions, etc. Kind of like what they're talking about now when they wanting to cut a region, which is fair enough. The problem is there was too much infighting and too much ego in Welsh Rugby. Too much parochialism, like it is now really, still. But it was probably worse back then because you had lots of smaller enclaves of clubs which had built up rivalries over 100 years of rugby in Wales. And then you were asking teams who were historical enemies to come together and form a region. Obviously, people didn't want to do that. Unfortunately, there was no other option because there were Financially, it wasn't viable to have the clubs. The WRU could not keep bailing out the clubs, and if they wanted to compete internationally and the clubs not get battered week in, week out against French teams or English teams in the European Cup like what was happening, they had to consolidate the talent and the funding. Hence the birth of the regions. The problem was then is not everyone wanted to be a region, and they didn't set up really the regions properly. You had Ospreys, which was and has still been called the true proper region. Newport was kind of a region with the Gwent, and I think they've done a lot, especially in recent years, to really cultivate that relationship and done a good job off the pitch in making the Gwent feel like part of the Dragons. And then you have, of course, the Celtic Warriors, which was the Valleys. But Cardiff and Llanelli didn't want to give up their identity. They wanted to remain Cardiff and Llanelli. Because the union couldn't get them to just decide and be a region, they kind of just let them off and just made them super clubs. And then you had issues where they were not representing an area, so areas were getting kind of forgotten about. North Wales was represented by the Scarlets, which geographically makes no sense. Cardiff just had the Cardiff metropolitan area. And then when unfortunately the Celtic Warriors disbanded and went bust, they then absorbed the Valleys, or the majority of the Valleys, along with the Ospreys. And those are the historical real derbies, the Valleys against Cardiff teams. That was like the real rivalry. They never embraced Cardiff, in my opinion. Cardiff never embraced them. And from being out in the community, I work a lot in RCT, in schools, in clubs, sports clubs up there, speak to people all the time, and the amount of stories I've had of the talent getting missed from RCT that should have played for Cardiff over a Cardiff boy is like numerous. And the funding system, the contracts and everything was kind of never here nor there. For example, by like sort of the late 2000s and the early 2010s, the Irish provinces were all centrally funded, and they were actually based on historic provinces, so it was a little bit easier for them to break it down. The English clubs had a lot of private investment, and this wasn't always good, as we saw the likes of Richmond going bust, but that's where a lot of their money came from. Regions relied on WRU distribution, heavily on gate receipts, short-term sponsorships, the national side ticket sales, and of course benefactors who would often have to come in and plug the black holes that were left from running the club. And we saw the issues with this, of course, when Leighton Samuel couldn't afford or didn't want to pay for the Celtic Warriors anymore. They went to the wall. Cardiff, when unfortunately Peter Thomas passed away, he had kept the club afloat a lot of times. And then you had the likes of Helford Capital, who promised the world and delivered nothing. And that's what's ended Cardiff being in union ownership. You can even say about the Galacticos era, when as soon as Mike Cuddy business went bust, the players and that playing squad that was superb and assembled with the Avengers slowly got picked away, and then they returned to the mean, crucially due to constant civil war between the union and the regions, and the cyclical nature of benefactors who are willing to come and put a lot of money into your club. It stopped being about putting the best product on the field necessarily, but more about surviving year to year for the regions, which over time slowly detrimented the standards, and we ended up in the point where we are now, where the budgets are right on the floor and we're struggling with squad depth. As soon as we get a few injuries, we're bringing up, semi-pro people from the SRC who aren't ready necessarily for the level at the moment. Another thing that kind of gets overlooked, and it's not necessarily a decision, or not at least a conscious decision, but that was the success of the national side was hiding the decline of the regions. The regions slowly were getting less and less competitive in the league and in Europe, but because we had Warren Gatland and the golden generation of players that had kept us competitive and really winning trophies for such a long time, even when the regions were struggling, Wales did relatively well. I mean, between 2005 and 2021, Wales won the Six Nations 6 times and 4 times were Grand Slam champions with 2 World Cup semi-finals and were ranked number 1 in the world at the time. And from the outside looking in, people were saying, wow, look at that Welsh team, they're amazing. But the problem was there was no young blood coming into the team, or very little, and there wasn't players getting cycled over, and we were getting more and more heavily reliant on these stalwart players like Alan Wynne-Jones and Dan Biggar and Gethin Jenkins, who were racking up these massive cap totals, and to be honest, had amazing durability and levels of ability over that time. But we weren't getting experience for younger players who could step up. And it wasn't even necessarily a lack of talent. It was to sustain where we were in the national zeitgeist and keep trying to win. Then we sacrificed giving experience to younger players at times. And then once the golden generation came to an end, there wasn't that group of players that had already come through. It was starting again from scratch. And somewhere in there is where my next big decision, and this was a decision, was made, which caused so much issues and more has caused it now. And it's something they're actually trying to rewrite now. And that was the disbanding of the National Academy. Now, for anyone who's not sure what the National Academy is, just a brief overview. It was a system above the regional academies. So once the regions went down to 4, they all had proper top class academies that were created for them, and then they had the National Academy, which was above them, and it was a group of 50 to maybe 70 or 80 players who were specifically pinpointed and picked out as the cream of the crop, athletically wise or skill wise or ability or something like that. And then they gave them an extra level of detail and pinpoint coaching to ensure that they reached their highest potential. And literally the majority of the golden generation went through this. And just an example of this, it was like the likes of Halfpenny and Dan Biggar were meeting regularly with Neil Jenkins, who would take them to go and do kicking. You might have Jonathan Davis go in and he had a specific strength and conditioning program. Maybe a player would be struggling with passing, and they would work on specifically on that. So they'd have their academy and regional training, and then they would have this level above it. And this is what allowed great players to become top players, gave them that extra level up. And unfortunately, around 2013, that was scrapped by Roger Lewis. And the reason it was basically a cost-saving exercise. And that never got replaced. All of the then training and development was left at the hands of the regions, who, in fairness, didn't have the funds or the resources to give that extra level of excellence and bespoke training. And also, they were, concerned about getting a team on the field that can win week in, week out. And the standard, unfortunately, dropped. Now, this is always sort of put as a cost-saving exercise, but it isn't as black and white as that, obviously. So the union paid for part of it, but it was actually nearly roughly 50% of it was funded by the EU. And once that grant had dried up, it was also part of the Welsh government had put money into it as well. Once the grant dried up, the WRU decided that they weren't going to make that gap up, and they were just going to do away with it altogether. And yeah, it's lunacy now looking back, in my opinion, but it's not as black and white as in they just didn't want to pay for it anymore. The money that they were getting for it was coming from the EU, basically, or a large chunk of that money. And then building off also my point about the national success covering for the regional decline, this was partly as well, I missed this, so I'm going back, partly to do with the fact that the contracts were not as good in Wales as they were elsewhere. That's why a lot of our best players ended up going to France once they hit the 60 cap rule. And the 60 cap rule was what was keeping a lot of our players in Wales, because they wanted to play for Wales, because Wales were good and Wales were competitive on the world stage, and it was the pinnacle of Welsh rugby to play for Wales at the time. Then, once the national success begins to wane, then the wanting to stay for the 60 caps becomes less. It's got to the point now, due to the player strike, that they actually got rid of it. And then it gets to the point where players are thinking, well, Wales are not competing for Six Nations anymore. We're not going deep into tournaments. I can get so much more money over there. I'm just going to possibly go there for a bit more security and a bit more money. And the Joe Hawkins one is a great example of, he was playing for Wales and he was on an academy contract with the Ospreys, but they couldn't offer him a new contract really, because at the time the WRU had not given the proper PRB, and that's what ended up causing the strike action before the England game. So it was just, the avalanche just continues to build up momentum as you get all further down this list, and the layers upon layers of issues knock on to the next one, and they all start to build up to basically an unstoppable force which literally raises everything to the ground. And then unfortunately, because the national success waned and Warren Gatland left, we brought in Wayne Pivac, who was supposed to usher in this new era, but as I mentioned earlier, the team was coming to a point where it was aging and a lot of players were retiring at the same time, and they weren't at their peak anymore. And to kind of combat this and find a new play style, Wayne Pivac got to the point where, whereas previously not many new caps had been handed out, he was just throwing them about like they were confetti. Unfortunately, never settling on anyone or a combination to build up that experience. So we ended up with a lot of people getting a couple of caps, but no one just nailing down a position. And then he was struggling to nail down his play style and find the players that he wanted to fit that play style. Then again, more losses came in. Wales stopped being that hard to beat team, stopped winning as regularly, wins became a lot less often, till the point where they got rid of Pivac and brought Gatland back out of pure desperation just to get us ready for the World Cup, which he did a pretty good job, if you have to say. But after the World Cup, then any remnants of that golden generation retired or moved away and knocked international rugby on the head. And then Gatland, unfortunately, didn't have the skills, or he was a little bit outdated, and he couldn't rebuild that team because it needed to be rebuilt from scratch. And it goes back to the reliance on older players. Then the union didn't really make a decision soon enough, in my opinion, to get rid of him. That can be an argument that people say we should have stuck with him. No one could have done a good job with this team necessarily. But we went from a team that was really hard to beat, physically strong, very fit, with a very good game plan and clinical when it came to big moments. And we just got to a point where Gatland had lost that identity in the team, and he didn't know how to get it back, and he didn't know how to maybe relate to younger players, and he couldn't find a new play style. There was different play styles, different attack coaches coming in and out, Rob Howley being in and out of different jobs, and it just got to a point where it was impossible for him to claw it back. And unfortunately, although I still really love Warren Gatland for what he did during that golden generation, I don't think it necessarily tarnished that part of his legacy, but it did kind of tarnish his reputation as a whole, because he ended up leading us from that golden period to the point where we went on the longest losing streak in Welsh rugby history. So that's what kind of brought us to this point. And then everything that I've spoke about previously in this video has all happened on top of the backdrop of a union that has not delivered on what it should as a Welsh Rugby union. We had a huge period of success. That money has seemingly vanished to nothing because it didn't get reinvested into grassroots, into academies, They invested into a hotel, a roof walk that was doomed from the start and is no longer being operated. It was jollies for members, corporate people, and board members who overstayed their welcome in an environment of misogyny, racism, and sexism. And it's all ended up being at this point. And I think a lot of the issues that we're currently facing do sit at the feet of the Welsh Rugby Union, and it's impossible to get around that. But the regions bear some blame as well, and then the union just didn't seem to ever really have the interest in anything outside of Warren Gatland's Team Wales competing in tournaments, and they kind of forgot all of the other stuff that was underneath that got them to where they were. And I don't want to be all doom and gloom on this video, even though it is a doom and gloom video. And I kind of feel like I'm a doom and gloom channel at this point. But there is still hope at the moment. With all of this stuff going on, the reshake coming in, and unfortunately, one of our teams looks likely to be getting cut. If they do it right, if they really get this decision right, and they invest in the development and the pathways, and get that working properly to where it was before, where we did unearth these talented players, then there is hope. Because I refuse to believe the talent isn't in Wales. The talent is there. You're just building things on foundations of custard all the time. But if we could somehow get those foundations right, then there is still hope. But then, back on the negative side is you're having to rely on the very union, an organisation that's brought the game in Wales to its knees, to revive it and bring it back up to where we hope it can be, and I think it could be. But that's just my opinion. Please let me know what you think. This video's gone on a bit longer than I was expecting. I've probably missed loads. If I have, let me know in the comments, and I will catch you on the next one.